Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute domino effect of historical events that paved the way for India's independence. It's not just some dry timeline, you know. It's actually this incredible story of how hyper-localized, everyday grievances completely snowballed into a massive, unified national movement. Let's get right into it.
We're going to break this dense history down into 6 really logical chapters. We'll start with the spark of Indian nationalism, then look at the weapon of Satyagraha, the non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience, and the Salt March, the diverse voices of Swaraj, and finally, forging a collective belonging.
Chapter 1. The Spark of Indian Nationalism. Okay, to really grasp the push for freedom, we first have to understand the sheer level of desperation on the ground. 12 to 13 million. That is a staggering, heartbreaking number. According to the 1921 census, that's how many lives were lost to widespread famine and a devastating viral influenza epidemic. It's hard to even wrap your head around, right? The everyday person was suffering immensely, creating an environment that was completely ripe for massive change.
And compounding all that natural devastation was the First World War. Now, you might be thinking participating in the war would bring some sort of relief or benefit, but actually it was the exact opposite. To fund the British war effort, income taxes were slapped on the population, custom duties were hiked up, and villagers were literally forced into army recruitment. The prices for basic everyday goods just skyrocketed, so the result? Severe, crushing economic distress and a deeply rooted hatred toward British colonial rule.
Chapter 2. The weapon of Satyagraha.
So anger is brewing everywhere. Then, in 1915, Mahatma Gandhi returns to India from South Africa, and he brings this revolutionary new concept for resistance with him, called Satyagraha. Now, the absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that Satyagraha was not just passive resistance. No way. It was a highly active, nonviolent weapon. The core idea was that if your cause is true and you're fighting real injustice, you don't need physical force. You literally defeat the oppressor just by revealing the truth to them. Gandhi was convinced this shared power of nonviolence could unite the entire subcontinent.
And he didn't just talk about it. He rapidly built momentum by testing this out in localized, fast-paced campaigns. In 1917, he's in Bihar helping peasants in Champaran fight an oppressive indigo plantation system. That very same year, he heads over to Kedah in Gujarat to demand tax relief for farmers whose crops had failed. Fast forward to 1918, he's in Ahmedabad securing wage bumps for cotton mill workers through a hunger strike. He was basically building this immense grassroots momentum from the ground up before taking on national laws.
Well, the British government absolutely panicked at this growing unity. In 1919, they rushed through the infamous Rowlatt Act. This was a black law that let them throw political leaders in jail for 2 whole years without even a trial. So Gandhi launches a nationwide Rowlatt Satyagraha in response. But the colonial pushback was just brutal. General Dyer imposes martial law, which directly leads to the absolutely horrific Jallianwala Bagh massacre on April 13th. Troops opened fire on thousands of completely unaware, unarmed civilians. The trauma of that specific day fundamentally changed the DNA of the struggle. It was so appalling that Rabindranath Tagore actually returned his knighthood in sheer disgust.
Chapter 3. The Non-Cooperation Movement.
Realizing that these isolated protests just weren't going to cut it anymore, Gandhi saw an opportunity to unite Hindus and Muslims using the post-war Caliphate issue, which was a huge concern for Indian Muslims regarding the Ottoman Empire. His logic for this broader push was laid out in his 1909 book Hind Swaraj, and it's brilliantly simple. British rule only survived in India because Indians cooperated with it, right? So to systematically dismantle that cooperation, he proposed 3 steps. Step 1, surrender all British titles and honors. Step 2, totally boycott the army, the police, courts, schools, and foreign goods. And Step 3, if the British try to suppress this, launch a full-blown civil disobedience campaign.
And you know what? It worked incredibly well at first. The economic shock was massive. Between 1921 and 1922, the import of foreign cloth was literally cut in half, plummeting down to just 57 crore rupees. People were out there picketing liquor shops, throwing foreign clothes into these massive bonfires, and proudly wearing hand-woven Indian khadi instead.
But, as often happens, the movement hit some major real-world roadblocks. Hand-woven khadi cloth was just way too expensive for the average person, and there weren't nearly enough alternative Indian schools or institutions to replace the British ones. So, out of pure necessity, people started drifting back. The final fatal blow, though, came in 1922 at Chowri Chowra. A peaceful protest tragically turned into a violent, deadly clash with the police. Since Gandhi was strictly uncompromisingly committed to nonviolence, he abruptly pulled the plug and called off the entire non-cooperation movement.
Chapter 4. Civil Disobedience and the Salt March.
Okay, so after a period of sort of political recalibration and the massive global shockwave of the 1929 Great Depression, the stage is set for an even more aggressive form of resistance. The big catalysts here were some deeply insulting colonial policies. Get this, the British send over the Simon Commission to review Indian laws, but they don't include a single Indian member. Not one. This blatant disrespect totally enraged leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and sparked these massive Simon Go-Back protests everywhere. Fed up with vague promises of dominion status from Lord Irwin, the Congress holds their Lahore session in December 1929 and finally draws a line in the sand. They demanded Purna Swaj, which means complete, total independence.
But if you're going to demand complete independence, you desperately need a symbol that unites everybody. So Gandhi sends Viceroy Irwin an ultimatum to abolish the salt tax. Now you might be wondering, of all the things in the world to protest, why salt? Let's look at why this everyday little mineral was the absolute perfect catalyst. It's simple, really. Salt was a basic, fundamental necessity for human survival, consumed by the ultra-rich and the extremely poor alike. The British having a monopoly and slapping a tax on it was seen as profoundly, universally unjust. And this led to the epic Dandi March. Gandhi and 78 volunteers literally walked 240 miles over 24 days. And as they marched, they gathered thousands of followers. Finally, on April 6, 1930, they reached the sea and illegally boiled salt water. This simple action became a universally relatable act of defiance that just completely captured the imagination of the entire nation.
Now, actually, let's make a really vital distinction here. In 1921, the non-cooperation movement was mostly about just ignoring or boycotting the British. But by 1930, the civil disobedience movement was a whole different beast. This was about actively, yet peacefully, breaking colonial laws, like manufacturing your own salt, or marching into reserve forests, and just outright refusing to pay taxes. It was a massive escalation.
Chapter 5. Diverse Voices of Swaraj.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this movement, we have to recognize a pretty fascinating fact. The word freedom didn't mean the exact same thing to everyone. Swaraj literally means self-rule, but in practice, it acted like this massive umbrella. It created a super complex coalition where every single social class projected their own desperate, localized needs onto Gandhi's national message.
When you break down the different demographics, it's wild how fragmented their motivations actually were. I mean, rich peasants just wanted relief from high taxes. Poor peasants wanted their unpaid rents completely forgiven. The business class, they formed groups like Fikchi and funded the movement because they wanted protection against foreign imports. Plantation workers over in Assam genuinely believed Swaraj meant they could finally leave the tea gardens and get free land back home, though, tragically, when they tried to leave, they were caught and brutally beaten by police. And then you had tribal groups, totally fed up with losing access to their forests, who launched armed, violent revolts under leaders like Alluri Sitaram Raju, which, operated completely outside of Gandhi's strict nonviolent ideology. So, as you can imagine, keeping this fragile coalition together was incredibly tough. These groups had wildly conflicting interests. A prime example is when Dalit leader Dr. B.R. Ambedkar demanded separate electorates for the depressed classes. The British actually agreed to it, but Gandhi, terrified this would legally and permanently fracture Indian society, went on a fast in protest. Ultimately, they worked out a really crucial compromise with the Pune Pact of 1932. This ensured reserve seats for the depressed classes, but kept it within the general electorate, beautifully prioritizing social unity above all else. Chapter 6. Forging a Collective Belonging. So, with such a vast, incredibly diverse population, holding totally different goals and suffering in totally different ways, how on earth did India finally forge a single national identity? Well, it wasn't just the politics of marches and protests. It was a deep, profound cultural awakening. A sense of collective belonging was forged through that shared, unifying struggle against a common enemy. But it was also fueled by a massive effort to reinterpret history, to instill real pride in India's rich heritage. It was driven by the emotional, visceral power of folklore, fiction, and unifying songs like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Vande Mataram. And maybe most crucially, it relied on striking visual symbols. Think of the personification of the country as Bharat Mata, or the iconic tricolor Swaraj flag that Gandhi himself designed in 1921. These gave people a tangible, unifying banner to rally behind. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. How does a massive, incredibly diverse population take a tangled web of highly localized, personal sufferings and turn it into one single, unstoppable national identity? The Indian struggle for Swaraj shows us that it takes powerful symbols, brilliant strategic leadership, and above all, a shared vision that completely transcends personal grievances. What lessons do you think this epic historical synthesis holds for the complex modern movements we're seeing in the world today?